If you're thinking about moving to Bowie and you're not sure whether you should purchase a home or rent, then this video is for you. So let's go ahead and break down some of the top pros and cons of either renting or buying in Bowie, Maryland. Now, before I dive into the pros and cons, I do want to mention Bowie's a pretty fantastic place to live, right? I have a whole different video devoted to that, but I'm just going to say for right now, it's a great spot, right? Super convenient to Annapolis, DC, Baltimore. It's probably one of the most popular cities in Prince George's County. My wife and I actually purchased our first home there and lived there for about 5 years, and it still has a little special place in my heart. That being said, let's dive in. Now, one of the first things I always like to discuss anytime I have someone saying, hey, should I go purchase or rent a home? And I always say, like, look, what's your timeline? Like, are you planning to be here for a long time or just a short time? You know, if you tell me, hey, look, I'm only going to be here for 1 or 2 years, I'm going to say you probably just want to go rent a home unless you're okay with having your home be an investment property and holding it as a long-term rental. Now, I say that because basically it usually takes a few years to gain that appreciation, gain that equity in the home, and be able to pay for all the costs of buying and selling. So it's not that your value of your home is going to go down, but the fact is when you sell a home, it does cost money, right? Between paying the realtors, the government, fixing things up, etc. It costs a certain amount of money. So usually you need a few years in order to get some equity to at least break even, if not make a profit. What is that sweet spot? Well, I'm going to say in a normal market, I usually like to say 3 years is kind of like the minimum where you might kind of get, break even or could be close either direction. 5 to 7 years is usually where you make a nice little profit, right? So this does completely vary on the market. It depends if you do any sweat equity on the home, if you can fix it up, etc. So it is all case by case, but just as a starting measure, I'm going to say, hey, how long do you plan to stay here? So again, 1 to 2 years. Unless you want to keep that place as a rental, probably just go rent. One of the next points that people like to consider is the freedom to make the space your own. Like actually right here behind me, this crazy looking wall, this is actually my music studio that I built with a friend. And I couldn't do that if I was renting, right? Like I can build this room the way I want because we own the home. If you're renting, you don't have that luxury to really personalize the space the same way you would if you're renting. Whether that's painting, putting shelves up, redoing the kitchen, redoing the bathroom, putting a deck on, maybe even some of the landscaping. Like generally speaking, when you're renting, it is what it is, and that's what you got. So if you want that freedom to really customize the space, then that is a strong reason to consider owning. Now, the next pro and con that you have to consider is sort of the long-term wealth building. So let's pretend like your timeline works. You're like, hey, look, I'm going to be in Bowie for several years. I can afford the down payment. I can get closing help or do this or do that. And you're like, hey, this will work. One of the things I like about owning that you have to you want to put into consideration is long-term financial gains and also the financial tool. So what do I mean by that? Well, typically, if you look at the last 100 years, homes usually appreciate. So if you buy a home today, in 10 years, it's usually worth more money, right? That's pretty sweet. If we look at most of the millionaires, other than some of the crypto stuff that's in the last couple of years, most of them own a lot of real estate. Like real estate is one of those things where it's made a lot of people really, really wealthy. And if you have that home, that also means, and you gain equity, that also means you might better use it as a tool, like doing a home equity line against it. So for an example, let's say you buy a home today, and I don't know, in 10 years, maybe you have a kid who goes to college, or maybe you get hurt or lose your job, or I don't know, you want to add a pool or something, right? There's always something that you might want to do. Well, the reality is if you have equity and you go get a home equity line, you can borrow against your own home in order to use that cash to do something. And that's pretty cool because if you're renting, you can't do that. You can't be like, hey, I rent this home. Let me use this as the collateral. It doesn't work that way. So I love the financial wealth and like that building and using that as collateral. I think is a big, big plus as far as ownership versus renting. All right, the next item to kind of consider, which is definitely a pro for the renting side, is maintenance and responsibility. When you own the home, it's yours. That means also all the problems, right? So if that roof starts leaking, if your heat pump dies, the toilet's leaking, you name it, that's on you. So it's one of those bits where that can get expensive. Now, you can do things to sort of hedge your bets, like buy a home warranty. We actually have a home warranty on our own home here. It's we replaced 2 heat pumps, a dishwasher, a washing machine, another washing machine. It's really worked, also a water heater. So it's really benefited us from a cash flow perspective, not having to outlay all those big ticket items all at once, and just being able to have that warranty really has helped us. Now, is it silver bullet? Do I love the whole experience? No, of course not. It's like any other insurance, right? But what I'd say is it has worked for us. So if you're renting, one thing that's nice though is, hey, not your problem, right? Like, it's not your house. So if that roof starts leaking, you call the property manager or the landlord, you're like, hey, the roof's leaking. Now, some rental agreements might have a smaller deductible or something in there, but for the most part, people generally don't charge you much or at all, unless you do something that's negligent, right? Like, I don't know, you drove your car into the garage door. Well, then that was your fault, right? Like, so there, of course, there's situations where you are responsible, but for the most part, you really have very limited responsibility in a rental versus if you own the home. So if you're looking for just like no responsibility, maybe you're traveling a lot and you just can't be bothered with things, well, hey, rental, that's definitely a perk right there. All right, just the last part on the money side of things, you may want to know, is it cheaper to rent or is it cheaper to purchase from a monthly like cash outlay point of view? And I'm gonna say this completely depends, right? Like, are you putting down 0% down if you were to purchase? Are you putting 5% down? Are you putting 20% down? So how much money you put down, and also what does that interest rate look like, is gonna be a big part of what's your mortgage. And then we gotta compare that to what's the rental market like. So really, it just depends. There are certain markets, particularly when you get to the really expensive stuff, sometimes it would be cheaper to rent versus purchasing just from a straight cash outlay. Now, that doesn't mean you can do what you want with the house and all the other things, so that might not work for you, right? But just from a straight cash outlay, sometimes renting might be cheaper. In my case here, for like our home, I know looking at the rental pricing, it is cheaper for me to own the home than it is to rent, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Like, you would think sometimes renting would be cheaper, but the rental market's been pretty insane the last few years. So what I'm gonna say is it's very case by case. The other thing to throw out there, which is a weird kind of emotional nuance here, there's a lot of people who say, well, I would rent that because whatever, it's just a rental. But I wouldn't buy that. If I'm buying, I want it to be all this other stuff. So a lot of times people don't compare apples to apples. So if you want to have that conversation, let's talk. It's just easier to find out what you're doing, and then we can give you some numbers and some stats, and then you can kind of see what makes more sense to you. The last point to kind of cover is flexibility, and I'm going to put this in the rental column. So if you are in a situation where you're like, look, I'm moving to the area, I'm not sure if I really like Bowie, or I'm not sure if I even want to live in Maryland, well, then go rent for a year and figure out the area. Because the thing is, if you don't like it, great, your year's up, and then move, go on, right? Like, that's pretty easy. Where if you purchase, now you're kind of stuck unless you pay to sell it and do all those things. So if you need that flexibility just to be like, get out of the area more quickly, a rental, I think, is going to definitely be something that you want to strongly consider versus purchasing. Okay, so in conclusion, when you're thinking about renting versus buying, the key takeaway is, how long are you going to be here? What does your future look like? What kind of money, financial resources are you working with? And what are your goals? Like, do you need that flexibility, or would you rather start building wealth? I'm going to say for most people, once they can financially afford to go purchase a home, and if they know they're going to be here for a few years, most people just want to go purchase and start building that wealth, and that works really well for them going towards that American dream. For the people who, again, are not sure if they want to live here, stay here, etc., that's where the rental really comes into play. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions about buying or renting here in Bowie or any of the surrounding areas, shoot us a DM, give us a call. We're happy to help.